どうか私と共に力を合わせてパラディ島の悪魔と戦ってほしい。
多分生まれた時からこうなんだ。俺は進み続ける。敵を駆逐するまで。
パラディ島勢力へ宣戦布告を。I'm crying with you forever. I don't have that power. Oh, I'm standing out on high. No one's left and there's no one.
Oh my god, what the hell did I just watch? Is Eren Yeager the real Sisyphus?
No, that's the sneak peek of our presentation, no?
What do you mean sneak peek? Philosophy class to. Ano kinalaman ng Attack on Titan?
Girl, kasi nga 'di ba, yung scenes dun sa Attack on Titan, related sila sa nangyari dun sa The Myth of Sisyphus ni Albert Camus.
Pero I think the sneak peek should be 5 minutes kasi I'm enjoying Eren's,
Girl, sneak peek, 5 minutes? Are you serious? That's absurd.
What's absurd? That's a deep word na for me to understand. Naririnig ko nga lang yun sa mga movie na may mga British accent.
British? Oh, come
Yeah,
on,
British.
Isha. Do better. Yung Myth of Sisyphus, nagre-revolve siya around the absurdity of existence. Yung sinasabi niya na life is just meaningless, ganon.
Fine. Can we start our discussion na para magets ko na yung absurd na yan?
Not only that, you have to finish the whole thing, yung buong discussion. Kasi, at the end of this, magkaka-storytelling tayo para mas maintindihan natin lalo.
What? Magkikita ko ulit si Eren mamaya. Sige. Okay,
My
fine.
God.
Go.
Okay. Now, let's move on to discuss Albert Camus' work, The Myth of Sisyphus.
Before we begin on the detailed discussion of Albert Camus' philosophical essay, The Myth of Sisyphus, let me first give you a gist, just so we can understand the whole picture Camus is trying to paint. So, he touches upon the absurdity of existence as a whole and raises the question of suicide and the meaning of life. Extrapolating his quote, he says, "There is but one truly serious philosophical problem, and that is suicide. It is a potent image of futility that life is pointless and useless in the end. He believes that the recognition of the absurdity of existence liberates us from the belief in another life or implacable grandeur that is futile, or that humans are very meaningful and profound, when in fact the universe wasn't even made for us and will continue to exist long after the last human has ushered his last breath. It permits us to live in the present, to see the beauty and the pleasure the now brings." Albert Camus was born on November 7, 1913, and died on January 4, 1960. He's an Algerian-French philosopher, well known for his works, specifically 3 novels, The Stranger, The Plague, The Fall, and his 2 major philosophical essays, one that we will be discussing now, titled The Myth of Sisyphus, and the other being The Rebel. He gave a different account of philosophy and politics of existentialism from Jean-Paul Sartre. So Sartre believed that existence precedes essence and that there is only relative local absurdity. Camus, however, contended that essence precedes existence and that the absurd is universal and absolute. His ideas of the absurd are closer to Nietzsche and Kierkegaard, wherein absurdity is a direct consequence of the absence of God. Let us now move on to the very first chapter of An Absurd Reasoning, titled Absurdity and Suicide. this whole chapter tells us that the meaning of life is the most urgent of questions, and whether suicide is the solution for us to achieve solace and freedom from the absurd. So, how did Albert Camus actually discuss this? So, what he did was first judge whether life is or is not worth living amounts to answering the fundamental question of philosophy. All the rest come afterwards. So he says that by giving an example of trying to find an answer to whether or not the world has 3 dimensions, who would even care to answer this question if life itself, the fundamental question, is meaningless? So without solving or answering the question, what is the meaning of life? Nothing could ever be worthwhile. Now we ask, why is the meaning of life the most urgent of questions? Camus says that he has never seen anyone die for the ontological arguments regarding metaphysics dealing with the nature of being. So, to make things clearer by putting them into perspective with an example, Galileo, who held scientific truth of great importance, abjured it with great ease as soon as it endangered his life. Another person, hypothetically, remained faithful to his beliefs, even at the cost of his own life. Albert believes that Galileo has made the right decision, as the truth was not worth the stake for his own life. He did not see that it was worth it to sacrifice your own life just to find out the truth. It leaves us pondering on who we think made the right decision, whether it's Galileo or another person. So he sees that a lot of people died because they judged that life is not worth living, that people are paradoxically getting killed for the ideas or illusions that give them a reason for living. He says, what is called a reason for living is also an excellent reason for dying. Because of this, it creates more questions like, how do we reconcile this opposing attitude, like taking one's own life towards existence? How can we make sense of suicide? How can we justify the act of suicide? Once again, it all loops back to the first fundamental question, which is, what is the meaning of life? To answer these questions above. In summary, these scenarios convince us that the meaning of life is the most urgent of questions. Camus mentions these 2 methods of thought called La Palisse and Don Quixote to figure out those thoughts humans generate that causes the risk of leading to death, or the polar opposite, intensifying the passion of the living. It represents the 2 extreme ends of the spectrum. First, let's discuss La Palisse, which means evidence in Albert's work. It is based on a French nobleman who is always associated with jokes based on truism and represents the overemphasis on reality and the logical truth, to the point where it is comical. In a quote, it says that if life is not worth living, then we'd better die. For example, a good situation of La Palisse is people who find meaning in raising children, which forget that those very lives that they raise are just as useless as their own, in line with the thought of humanity being bound to disappear anyway. On the other side of the spectrum is called Don Quixote, which means lyricism in Camus' work. It is based on a novel character who aspired a life of knighthood in his own imagination. He faced no peril and hardship in real life, so instead he invented them in his mind. To Camus, he represents the people who create their own meaning to life. sometimes to the point of absurdity. So lyricism means that they are giving meaning to those things who are otherwise meaningless. Another example of this are people speculating world conspiracies that, there is something more to what is known. In the end, Camus says that solely the balance between evidence, la palisse, and lyricism, Don Quixote, can allow us to simultaneously achieve emotion and lucidity. Next, he discusses suicide as a social phenomenon. Albert says that the social perspective of suicide will never take into account the existential crises of a single individual. This was at least during Camus' time. Books rarely take the individual's feelings into account and are usually reported in numbers or statistics. In his essay, Camus focuses on the relationship between the individual's thought and the act of suicide. He says that an act like this is prepared within the silence of the heart, as it is a great work of art. He considers that killing oneself equates to an act of confession, since the act of killing yourself confesses that one thinks life is too much or that one does not understand it. Living naturally is never easy, everyone knows that. Continuing by making gestures commanded by existence for many reasons, the first of which is habit. On the other hand, dying voluntarily implies that you have recognized the ridiculous character of that said habit, the absence of any profound reasoning for living, and the uselessness of suffering. The feeling of absurdity is becoming detached to life due to a myriad of reasons, namely the absence of a reason for living, the deprivation of the hope of a promised land, probably a concept of something like heaven, and the lack of deeper, meaningful, and profound existence. Is suicide the solution to free oneself from the feeling of absurdity? For Camus, the answer is no. He asks, in the face of such contradictions and obscurities, must we conclude that there is no relationship between the opinion one has about life and the act one commits to leave it? The body's judgment or survival instinct does everything it can to stay away from death. When one kills oneself because life is not worth living, it certainly is true, yet an unfruitful one. Does absurd dictate death? Well, from a logical perspective, absurd does imply suicide because, once again, it tells us that life is meaningless. But for Camus, he says that humans are innately almost impossible to be logical to the bitter end or death. So some chicken out and reject even the thought of it, like our example earlier, Galileo. This is considered the irrational side of existentialism. Let us now move on to the next chapter of An Absurd Reasoning, titled Absurd Walls. The whole chapter discusses how we feel absurdity through certain situations, like inexperience, and on an intellectual level, to see the connection of the individual and the absurd, and also to understand the choices of suicide and, of course, hope. So, how? Camus says that deep feelings mean more than anything else, and we see the world from the point of view of that feeling. So, for example, thinking that the world is bad makes the world do look bad. The absurd frames how we perceive the world, being the elusive, destructive thing to an individual. Let us now discuss how we feel the absurd through experience. Camus lists two sample scenarios for this situation. Number one is called the mechanical life. Imagine yourself in a normal 9 to 5 day job. Like it's a loop that drains you and leaves you weary. This is happening every single day. And even though this is something considered as normal and easy to follow as a lifestyle, one day one might ponder and the question of why arises. This then brings forth the absurd, asking, why this dull, boring, and repetitive life? The second situation is called the world devoid of meaning. It is seeing the world without the meaning we blanketed in. So we know that a stone is not just seen as a stone, but rather it's also a collection of atoms. Chopped up pieces of wood put together can create a table to eat food on. In Camus' words, at the heart of all beauty lies something inhuman, and these hills, the softness of the sky, the outline of these trees, at this very minute, lose the illusory meaning with which we had clothed them, henceforth more remote than a lost paradise. Next, let us discuss how we feel the absurd through the intellectual level. It focuses on distinguishing what is true from what is false. Camus says that the mind's deepest desire in the face of his universe is an appetite for clarity. However, as soon as the thought reflects on itself, what it first discovers is a contradiction. This then creates a vicious cycle due to our desire to understand and give meaning to the universe and to our existence. This is so we have one unified truth. Camus says, quoting Aristotle, that a unified truth is flawed and it will never happen due to the multiple layers of reality. So, realizing that there is no possibility that there is one unified truth which leads us to absurdity, as it is irrational.
Moving on to the philosophical suicide, starting with the absurd versus feeling absurd. So what is the absurd? It's a big idea, kind of like a philosophy concept. It's about life seeming confusing or not making sense sometimes. Next, what is feeling absurd? This is more about how we feel when things seem really strange or don't make sense to us personally. The feeling lays the groundwork for understanding but doesn't fully capture the absurd's meaning. The origin of absurdity. Absurdity is explained as arising from the comparison of contrasting elements like acts and context, intentions, and outcomes. It happens when we compare or mix things that are super different or don't really belong together. It highlights that the absurd exists in the discrepancy or divorce between elements, not within them individually. Common ground among thinkers. Camus is looking at how different clever thinkers think about this confusing thing called the absurd. Even though they all have their unique ways of seeing it, they might find some points where they think alike. Camus delves into deep topics exploring why some feel lost enough to contemplate serious actions like suicide. He also connects these thoughts to existential philosophy, which aims to decipher life's meaning in the face of its perplexities. Thinkers like Shestov, Kierkegaard, and Jaspers tried to rationalize or give divine explanations to make this heavy feeling of the absurd feel less burdensome. Moving on to the coexistence of humans and the world. The essence of the absurd is not exclusive to humans or the world, but in their coexistence. Their coexistence creates this essential connection where the absurd can only exist within the human mind and the world, not separately. The characteristics of the absurd essence are a constant fight without hope, a feeling of never being satisfied and trying to change things. And Camus said that ignoring or trying to get rid of these feelings weakens the idea of the absurd, making it less powerful or important. In terms of the meaning in non-acceptance, the absurd only keeps its importance because people don't agree with it or accept it. It's powerful because it doesn't follow the crowd and stays different from what most people believe. Its strength lies in not conforming or being the same as everyone else. Next, we have the confrontation with the absurd. When people face this confusing feeling, it's like they're stuck with it. There's no way to break free or disconnect from it once they've confronted it. It becomes a part of them, whether they like it or not. Next, the transformation of the absurd. Critics, philosophers, especially Shestov, try to change the absurd into something divine or deeply true. It highlights how altering the nature of the absurd takes away its essential qualities of opposing or understanding, causing conflict, and being something beyond our grasp. And lastly, the absurd man's perspective. This is about facing this struggle without trying to fix it and accepting life as it is, without expecting things to get better. It also embraces the chaos without seeking any hope for change. Moving on to Soren Kierkegaard's approach and critique. This delves into Kierkegaard's approach to the absurd, probably comparing it with Shestov's perspective, while pointing out a flaw in Kierkegaard's approach, specifically in balancing the irrational and nostalgic aspect connected to the absurd. Camus' critique of Kierkegaard's escape. Questioning Kierkegaard's way of tackling despair means doubting if putting all the focus on fate as the answer to life's big question is a bit too desperate. It's like saying relying solely on fate might not solve everything and might ignore other ways of figuring things out. Next, the middle path and limits of reason. This explores the idea of balancing intelligence and faith, acknowledging reason's limit while questioning Kierkegaard's pursuit of reconciliation and hope in situations that may not have straightforward answers. Lastly, the grappling with the human condition. Grappling with understanding what the absurd means for humans and their existence. It highlights the struggle between our thoughts and reality. It also suggests that, despite the inherent despair in the absurd, determined individuals might persist in seeking truth and understanding. For the next one, we have philosophical suicide and existential attitude. Philosophical suicide as an existential attitude where thought negates itself to transcend limitations. Existentialists consider this act of negation as their God, which they maintain through the continuous negation of human reason. Scrutiny of phenomenology. Examination of phenomenology, particularly Husserl's intentional method, which describes reality without explaining it. Husserl's intentional method studies conscious experience by analyzing how things appear in our minds, aiming to reveal the fundamental structures of human experience without assuming or explaining their true nature. Phenomenology claims multiple truths and aims to reveal depth in experience without unifying principles. We have conflict with the absurd. This challenges Husserl's idea by pointing out that, while they might be logically coherent, they seem to fall short in truly capturing or aligning with the chaotic and nonsensical nature of the absurd world. There's a suggestion that Husserl's transition from psychological truths to rational rules may not fully address the inherent absurdity present in reality. It's viewed as a metaphysical longing for consolation through eternal reason, which might not fit within the context of the absurd. For the last one under philosophical suicide, we have convergence of reason and irrationality. This explores how reason and irrationality can meet in philosophical thinking. Abstract and religious philosophers might seem different. They both acknowledge disorder or chaos in their thinking and find ways to support each other despite apparently opposing views. We have absurd mind's view. The perspective of the absurd mind perceives the world as inherently unreasonable and understands the constraints or boundary it possesses. Unlike reason, which can often alleviate distress or provide solace, The absurd mind recognizes its inability to ease anguish in the same way. Kierkegaard's concept of an apocalypse involves letting go of the longing for clear, absolute clarity in order to find satisfaction or contentment. The absurd man's realization. At the end of the road, motives become clear, transforming past conflicts into debates or arguments. The sin of the absurd man lies in the quest for knowledge, keeping truth within a state of dissatisfaction instead of actively seeking solutions. It's as if by constantly wanting to know more without finding answers, they maintain truth in a perpetual state of dissatisfaction. Next, we have the fidelity to the absurd. Stay true to the evidence of the absurd and refuses to ignore or deny its existence. They're not interested in what is called philosophical suicide, where people ignore the absurd. They focus on understanding the reasoning and integrity behind the act of suicide itself. For the last one, we have the danger in the leap. While Kierkegaard emphasizes the danger within the leap, the real danger lies in the moments leading up to it. Remaining steadfast at the peak of this existential leap signifies integrity, while stepping back from that position undermines it. For the next topic, we have the absurd freedom, starting with certainty and chaos. Conflict between certainty and uncertainty. People always want things to make perfect sense, but the world is often confusing and messy, which makes it tough to be sure about things. Consciousness versus reality. There's a big clash between how they see things and how the world really is. Their way of thinking doesn't quite match up with how chaotic and crazy the world can be. Importance of preserving personal truth. The importance of sticking to your own beliefs and what you find important, even when the world feels hopeless or doesn't make much sense. Holding on to what matters to you even if everything else seems chaotic. Persisting in the face of the absurd. This focuses on how tough it is to keep going and make choices when the world seems totally absurd. It's about acknowledging that we can't fully understand everything and learning to live with the weirdness of life without letting it stop us or control what we do. Finding meaning within certainty's limitations. Trying to find meaning and purpose even when we can't be totally sure about things. Nothing is completely certain, yet we still try to find importance and order in what we believe to be true and dependable. Next, we have the philosophical perspective on suicide and revolt. Absurdity of existence in suicide is the concept of suicide within the context of life's inherent meaninglessness. Rather than trying to find a clear meaning in life, accepting that life might not have an inherent purpose can actually lead to a better way of living. It sees suicide not as a logical conclusion but as an extreme way of embracing the absurdity of life. Living with awareness of absurdity is embracing life's absurdity as a valid philosophy. It means acknowledging that life doesn't inherently make sense and actively facing this fact with a rebellious attitude. It's about living fully aware that life might not have a clear purpose and choosing to confront this strangeness head-on. Revolt as philosophical position. Revolt means constantly challenging the clash between how we think and how absurd the world seems. It's a way to keep that weirdness alive and actually find meaning in life. True revolt is refusing to just accept the absurdity as final, unlike suicide, which is seen as giving in and ending the struggle against the absurd. Consciousness and revolt versus renunciation. Consciousness and revolt are portrayed as the unstoppable and passionate parts of being human that bring tension and truth by resisting the absurd. They stand in contrast to giving up or rejecting, which are seen as weaker responses to life's absurdity. Next, we have freedom, death, and the essence of living fully. Individual experience of freedom. This dismisses abstract notions of freedom as such and emphasizes personal experiences of freedom, especially in thought and action. It delves into the paradox of freedom in relation to the existence of God and evil, where the presence of God challenges human freedom. Absurdity of death and present freedom. Death's absurdity nullifies eternal freedom but enhances present freedom of action. It challenges preconceived notions of freedom, revealing that presumed freedom was an illusion. Inner freedom through realization. Understanding the limitations imposed by presumptions about freedom and purpose brings inner freedom. Recognition of the lack of a future liberates individuals from expectations and the pursuit of meaning, offering a newfound freedom. Liberation in absurdity. Similar to mystics finding liberation in surrendering to a higher power, the absurd man finds a form of freedom in recognizing death's absurdity. This reasonable freedom replaces illusions of eternal freedom, accepting a limited and absurd universe without consolation. Living within an absurd universe. Belief in the absurd shifts the focus from seeking life's meaning to living without concern for the future, fully embracing present experiences. It rejects value judgments in favor of experiencing a maximum quantity and variety of life moments. Ethical code and conscious living. Experiences, both imposed by modern life and individual contributions, shape one's ethical code. It emphasizes consciousness, revolt, and freedom as crucial aspects of living fully, advocating for experiencing the world as often as possible. Depth of experience versus life circumstances. Challenges the belief that depth of experiences depends on life circumstances, asserting that the quantity and variety of experiences depend more on individual consciousness. Lucidity and passionate engagement. The absurd teaches that no depth or sacrifice can equate to a longer conscious life. It underscores the importance of lucidity and conscious living over a prolonged duration. Embracing life's continuity. Reflections on the joy of continuous and conscious experiences on earth suggest that the most significant joy for the absurd man lies in passionately engaging with life's absurdities. For the last one under absurd freedom, we have revolt, freedom, and passion. The consequences of the absurd explores three consequences arising from the absurd: revolt, freedom, and passion. Consciousness transforms the idea of an invitation to death into a guiding principle for life, leading to a rejection of suicide despite an inherent resonance with despair. Nietzsche's influence. Camus draws from Nietzsche's idea that following a singular direction can lead to something meaningful on earth, aligning this concept with the path of the absurd man. Obedience to the flame, symbolizing both ease and difficulty, aligns with the distinctive ethical code. The importance of self-reflection. It encourages occasional self-assessment, emphasizing the individual's unique ability for introspection. It contrasts prayer as a descent into darkness with the encounter with despair, presenting the latter as a lucid, polar night that fosters passionate understanding and equivalence. The existential leap and paradox. The existential leap is depicted as both stirring and perpetuating the very paradox it attempts to resolve. It navigates the tension between seeking resolution and perpetuating the inherent contradiction within the absurd. Last, living beyond single perspectives. The narrative concludes by suggesting the limitations of settling for a singular perspective and emphasizes the necessity of transcending rigid definitions or ways of thinking. It advocates for a broader approach to living that extends beyond limited viewpoints.
Whether it's being chained to a burning wheel, turned into a spider, or having an eagle eat one's liver, Greek mythology is filled with stories of the gods inflicting gruesome horrors on mortals who angered them. Yet one of their most famous punishments is not remembered for its outrageous cruelty, but for its disturbing familiarity. Sisyphus was the first king of Ephyra, now known as Corinth. Although a clever ruler who made his city prosperous, he was also a devious tyrant who seduced his niece and killed visitors to show off his power. This violation of the sacred hospitality tradition greatly angered the gods. But Sisyphus may still have avoided punishment if it hadn't been for his reckless confidence. The trouble began when Zeus kidnapped the nymph Aegina, carrying her away in the form of a massive eagle. Aegina's father, the river god Aesopus, pursued their trail to Ephyra, where he encountered Sisyphus. In exchange for the god making a spring inside the city, the king told Aesopus which way Zeus had taken the girl. When Zeus found out, he was so furious that he ordered Thanatos, or death, to chain Sisyphus in the underworld so he couldn't cause any more problems. But Sisyphus lived up to his crafty reputation. As he was about to be imprisoned, the king asked Thanatos to show him how the chains worked and quickly bound him instead, before escaping back among the living. With Thanatos trapped, no one could die, and the world was thrown into chaos. Things only returned to normal when the god of war, Ares, upset that battles were no longer fun, freed Thanatos from his chains. Sisyphus knew his reckoning was at hand, but he had another trick up his sleeve. Before dying, he asked his wife, Merope, to throw his body in the public square, from where it eventually washed up on the shores of the river Styx. Now back among the dead, Sisyphus approached Persephone, queen of the underworld, and complained that his wife had disrespected him by not giving him a proper burial. Persephone granted him permission to go back to the land of living and punish Merope on the condition that he would return when he was done. Of course, Sisyphus refused to keep his promise, now having twice escaped death by tricking the gods. There wouldn't be a third time, as the messenger Hermes dragged Sisyphus back to Hades. The king had thought he was more clever than the gods, but Zeus would have the last laugh. Sisyphus's punishment was a straightforward task, rolling a massive boulder up a hill. But just as he approached the top, the rock would roll all the way back down, forcing him to start over, and over, and over, for all eternity.
In the end, Camus suggests that Sisyphus, despite his eternal struggle, finds contentment and meaning in the very act of pushing the rock. His defiance against the gods and his commitment to his task transform his fate into a source of fulfillment. The struggle itself, the perpetual effort towards the heights, becomes a reason for Sisyphus to be happy.